Today's talk is entitled, Put Your Hope in Something Better. So far in Hebrews, we began, or the book begins, with this very clear, upfront message. Jesus is better. And then the writer goes on to show throughout the rest of the first, 2/3 of the book or a little bit more, how Jesus is better and why it matters. And so this book is like packed full of awesomeness. And so we started with Jesus is better than the angels, then Jesus is better than Moses, Jesus has a better promise, Jesus is a better priest, specifically high priest, Jesus is a better sacrifice, and then last week we started the last 3.5 chapters, which switches gears a little bit, and we started with hold on to what's better. And so the last 3.5 chapters in Hebrews is an appeal to hold on to what's clearly better, that Jesus and his ways is what it's getting at, and not to trade your faith in for something lesser. And so this is kind of the last how Hebrews ends. And so last week we hit chapter 10. This week we're going to cruise into chapter 11. Some people call this the Hall of Faith. That could be, sure. It could be that. But I did a little just researching on why this chapter was was part of the letter. And so, because here's the thing. You could go from the end of chapter 10 right into chapter 12. But chapter 11, there's a whole bunch of reasons that it's in there. But the one that I want to give is I think it's so helpful after he's talked about faith and talked about that Jesus is better to give us an actual vision and picture of people who lived like Jesus was better and what it looked like. And so he goes through like a whole bunch of characters from the Old Testament. And it's pretty epic. And we can't go through them all. We're actually just going to pick a couple and then talk about their stories a little bit. But there's lots of questions that come up from some of the people listed in the book of, or chapter 11, because they're kind of shady characters. It's like, what? How did he get in here? One of them is Samson. But I was like, wow, he got into the Hall of Faith. That's pretty awesome. He was commended for his faith. And even though he was like, if you read the story of Samson, it's in the book Judges, and he was a judge in Israel. He wasn't that great of a dude. Had some glaring weaknesses and didn't follow God's instructions very well, and then is commended for his faith in Hebrews chapter 11, which I think is weird on one hand, but epically awesome on another, because man, does that ever relieve the pressure? And we'll talk about why at the end of this sermon. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off. I just have a couple of verses, because chapter 10, remember, this is a letter. There wasn't chapters and verses. It was just a letter, right? And so this is where we left off. And the reason is because he's going to explain something that's highlighted here. For in just a little while, the coming one, which is Jesus, will come and not delay. And my righteous ones will live by faith. So we're going to explore live by faith, because this is where he goes in the next chapter. But I will take no pleasure in anyone who turns away. But we are not like those who turn away from God to their own destruction. We are the faithful ones whose souls will be saved. So he's telling us what he's summing up this past chapter that we went through. But this is also an invitation to participate in the next chapter, not just to read it, but you can be a participant. This is awesome. Like, this is really, really cool that we can be part of the faithful ones that he's going to go through, the examples. And the invitation is to become one of the faithful ones. So let's get to it. Chapter 11, here we go. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. If you've ever wondered What's faith? Today's a good day because we're going to answer that question because he just answered it. Through their faith, the people in days of old earned a good reputation or were commended. And that's what's happening in this chapter. He is honoring the people that have gone before. And this is a common thing to do during this time, is to honor your ancestors. And so that's what he's doing. He's honoring the people who have gone before him. All right, so let's ask this question, like faith. Okay, so what is faith? What is it? It seems like this concept that is, what? We talk about it a lot. But if someone was to ask you point blank, define faith, like I was asked today, because I'm teaching on it, I was like, how do you put it in your own words? And so just a heads up, that is one of the questions in the small group, is define faith in your own words. Okay, so here we go. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. So here's some key words in understanding what faith is. Shows, hope, evidence, and see. Okay, so see and shows are similar. And ultimately, it's not just shows, it shows the reality. That's kind of one deal. Now, there are other translations use different words, like faith is the assurance of what is hoped for and the conviction of what is unseen. So that's the ESV. But we're just going to go through with the New Living Testament. What? Is that what? Translation. Sorry. Testament. Partly because the language is a little bit easier for us to understand. Okay, so here's the first kind of key word or key phrase. Shows the reality. So here's what our writer is trying to help us understand. That faith reveals that what we hope for is real. Okay, so he's not talking about the kind of, oh, I hope I get this for Christmas. It's not that kind of hope. The similarity is that our hope is always based in something that's coming. It's in the future, right? And so what we hope for is we're placing our hope in things that God says, specifically his promises about the future, right? Because that's where hope is oriented. It's something that's ahead. Okay, so it shows the reality, so it's revealing something. And specifically in this passage, it's revealing what God says, right? So what we hope for, it's the things that God has said, and specifically his promises. That's where our hope is placed. All right, so faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. So he's saying almost the same thing twice here using different language. And so when this word evidence I like it. I really like because it's similar to conviction. And I'll show you why. Evidence of things we cannot see. So again, it's about faith revealing something. And I'm using this language specifically so we can understand at the end of this, what is faith? Faith reveals what we cannot see is real. Okay? For instance, the fulfillment of God's promises. You can't see a promise, right? You can't see, well, you can see it written. But what I'm saying is if someone speaks and promises you something, you can't see that promise, right? Because it's words. And so evidence is very similar to conviction. Because here's what your eyeball is an organ, right? Is it not? Yeah? Okay. I don't remember. Science was a long time ago. Science class, I should say. So physical eyesight, so your eyeball, produces evidence or conviction of visible things, right? So I am looking at Grace. There's a conviction here that what I'm seeing is real, right? So it's the evidence is this Grace herself. I can see her, right? So that's what your eyesight does. So faith, similar to eyesight, physical eyesight, Faith enables us to see evidence of invisible things. And so it's like spiritual eyesight. Okay, so I think it's the easiest way to remember what faith is when we talk about eyesight, because in chapter 12, the writer is going to talk about fixing our eyes on Jesus. And throughout Hebrews chapter 11, he uses similar phrases, looking, seeing, and it's about this, it's about faith. It's about this spiritual eyesight. And so often you hear some of the pushback to faith is that faith is blind, like you can't actually see it. That's partially true. You can't actually see it is partially true because if you're just talking about physical things, then of course. But if you're talking about things that are unseen, the realities that your eyeball, the physical organ can't pick up, then how do you know about those realities? Faith is what opens your eyes to see. It's not blind, it's actually the opposite. So the Bible even talks about without faith, before faith is blindness. What faith does is it opens your spiritual eyes. So it's like a spiritual organ, right? And so this is how I want to define it for you. Faith is the spiritual organ that enables people to see the invisible realities of the spiritual world, specifically to understand and see who God is, to understand the gospel, the good news about Jesus. All of these things, because they have to be revealed, are about your spiritual eyes, which is faith, being opened. Without them, you can't get to know God. Isn't that interesting? That there's especially because the pushback in our culture is often because I can't see it, it's not real. And of course, there's some really good answers for that. And we don't have time to go through those today, but we can. In fact, you can put if that's a question you'd like, I'd be happy to answer that after, or you can wait till the next text in your question. Happy to answer it. Okay, so faith is a spiritual organ that enables people to see the invisible realities of the spiritual world, who God is, what he says, and things like that. Okay, we need to keep moving here. Because this is a big chapter, we're not going to read the whole thing, but we do want to kind of camp in a couple areas. Now, he goes on to give us an example. By faith, so this is verse 3, by faith we understand, so that there's one of our key words, that the entire universe was formed at God's command. So he's talking about speech. That what we now see, right, so what was formed, did not come from anything that can be seen. All right, let's explain that for a second. So creation as an example. So God's command, you can't see it, right? You can't see a command. You can hear it, but you can't see it. So what does faith do in this? Well, since God created everything, and we can see that with our physical eye, right? That's the evidence that we can see. But we can't understand that God did this through speech, which in our mind, by the way, is nothing. So God created everything that we can see with our eyes from nothing, meaning nothing we can see. Because it wasn't nothing because he spoke. Right? And so faith gives us understanding, this ability to see, and it's based on who God is. Right? It enables us to go like, okay, I understand that because of who God is, that he can speak. And when there's nothing to see, he can speak and create everything that is. Okay, so that is one of those things that's like, whoa. So what he's telling, he's like, you can't understand that without faith. And so if you're wondering why there's so much pushback at school maybe, or your teachers, or in universities for sure, it's because of that inability to see. So they can see with the physical eye the evidence of what happened, but they can't understand that God did it through his speech, that nothing became something, because that takes faith has to open your eyes there, your spiritual eyes. So that's the example. Okay, let's keep going. Hopefully you guys aren't confused by that. I got a psalm here that kind of gives us maybe a little picture, word picture, because it's poetic, of course, poem, about creation. So it's Psalm 33. The Lord merely spoke, and the heavens were created. So something from nothing. He breathed the word, something unseen, and all the stars were born, something that we can see. He assigned the sea its boundaries and locked the oceans in vast reservoirs. Let the whole world fear the Lord, and let everyone stand in awe of him, right? Any kind of being that can create anything, let alone the universe, anything from nothing, it's like, yeah, we should stand in awe. For when he spoke, the world began. It appeared, something we can see, at his command, from something unseen. All right, so that's our example. Okay, so let's get into a couple of the examples that the writer of Hebrews gives us. So starting in Genesis, our writer commends those who live by faith, the ones who have gone before us. And so we are given a snippet here, and we're just fast forward a little bit to verse number 6, chapter 11, verse 6, because he wants us to understand how these people made it, right? He's giving us a framework in how to, that's why that person like Samson made it. So Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, and it is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to him must believe that God exists and that he rewards those who sincerely seek him. Like, that sounds pretty good. I like that. Like, sincerely seek him. Look for him. Like, again, seek, right? It's a sight thing. We're seeking to understand, seeking to see. Okay, so we're going to jump into two characters. The first one is Abraham. And I'll tell his backstory a little bit, but we're going to just jump into the Hebrews part first, and then I'll do the backstory. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as an inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. Okay, so we find this story in the book of Genesis. And Abraham's just a regular dude. It appears as though, like, we don't know if he knew God or not. Like, the story doesn't tell us that Abraham knew God before God called him. And so we have this story of this random guy that God decides to choose, named Abraham. Now, he most likely he was from Mesopotamia, which is what we know, like, later on would be Babylon, which is kind of that Iraq area. And so, and there's no backstory to that. Gives us a little bit of Abraham's history. Of course, we know the genealogy, but not a lot of backstory. He's already like a full-grown dude when this happens. And so he says, okay. And so this is a big deal. Like, he actually moves everything. His family, all his possessions, herds, flock, like his possessions back then were like animals, right? So he moves them at this command from this God who has met with him and told him to leave this place and says and go to a place I will show you. It's wow. So he does, which is commendable already, right? Wow. So let's keep going. Verse 9. And even when he reached the land, God promised him he lived there by faith. For he was like a foreigner living in tents. And so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. So he went to a land that God gave him. We know that later as the promised land. That God gave Abraham this land, and that the writer, like Remember, this is just a few chapters ago, a little bit earlier in the letter. He's talking about Israel not entering his rest, right? So this is supposed to be in our minds when we are reading through this, because we've read this far into the letter, right? Okay, let's keep going. Abraham was confidently looking forward. So looking, there you go, looking forward, right? That's our future hope. Or hope, which is in the future. Looking forward to a city with eternal foundations. A city designed and built by God. It was by faith that even Sarah, who was Abraham's wife, was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promise. Now, this is an interesting part of the story. So God promised that Abraham that he would make a great nation, many nations actually, from Abraham. But his wife Sarah couldn't have any kids. And so, but Abraham still believed, right? It's like, okay. But as they aged and got older and older, it seemed like that promise wasn't going to be kept. So Abraham and Sarah decided that Abraham would marry Sarah's handmaiden or her servant. And so Abraham did and had a son through her. Her name was Hagar, and his name was Ishmael. Okay, but that was not God's plan. God had the promise that was given to Abraham would come through Sarah. It wasn't to come through Hagar. And so we have some strangers coming to visit Abraham. Abraham gives them hospitality, finds out that they're angels, and they repeat the promise. And Sarah overhears, and what do you think Sarah does? She laughs, because you know how old Sarah is at this time? 90. Okay, yeah, 90. I would laugh too. If I was 90, yeah, I need to have something to laugh about. And me having a child at 90 it's funny, right? And yet, Sarah obviously still believed, and she gave birth to a son. His name is Isaac, which means he laughs. I think he laughs, which is awesome, right? And so through Isaac comes the promise. Okay, so let's keep going. It was by faith that Sarah believed that God would keep his promise. And so a whole nation came from this one man who was as good as dead. Because you know how old Abraham was? 99, right? He's probably, I don't know, 99 seems pretty old to be making kids, right? And so that's why it's as good as dead. Like he shouldn't be able to make kids at that time. A nation, so what the writer is telling us here is there's something miraculous that happened, but he's commending, which was of course God, but he's commending Abraham for his faith. That was Abraham's part. Like the stars in the sky, the sand on the seashore, there is no way to count them. So we're going to fast forward a little bit because we want to get into another story here. So after he's listed a bunch of people, Abraham being one of them, this is where he goes. And this is a key verse. This is why we're going to hit this verse. All these people died, still believing what God had promised them. Right? What does it mean to live by faith? He's showing us what it looks like. They did not receive what was promised. Right? They died before the promise was fulfilled. But they saw, there's our language again, that they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. And it goes on to explain what that is. Today, we just don't have time to, although that's like a super important concept, we don't have time to do that today. So we're going to keep going. We got Moses. So our second character that we're going to dive into is Moses. It was by faith, starting in verse 24. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Which is interesting because we don't read that in the story, right? We know why he was, because he ran away because he killed somebody, right? He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. Now, we have to be careful here because the writer is not commending what Moses did. So here's the story was, Moses was born during a time when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. He was an Israelite boy, and the Pharaoh had ordered the death of all infant boys because he said that they're procreating too much and they're increasing too quickly. We need to get rid of this. And so his mother and father hid him in a basket. He was found by an Egyptian princess and taken into the palace and raised as an Egyptian. So Moses was there until 40 years old. So that's a long time to be a prince, right? To grow up in the palace. And what I think is being shown here is while Moses was growing up in the palace, the people of Israel were suffering more and more and more in slavery, in servitude to Pharaoh. And he saw an Egyptian taskmaster being cruel to one of the Israelite people, and he killed him. Moses killed him. It says he covered it up, we buried the body in the sand. This is interesting. Sorry, maybe I've watched too many movies, but I'm like, whoa, that's not going to go well. Foreshadow, right? It's in the sand. That is going to be discoverable. And sure enough, it is discoverable, and he's found out. And so he has to flee from Egypt. So it's interesting how the writer talks about this. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ, which is Jesus, right? Than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. So what the writer here is doing is not just going from this one little thing that happened that Moses did, but he starts there and your mind goes back to what he did, but then you look at his life like this and go like, okay, that's what's going on here. And we see this definitely in Moses throughout as he led Israel and all that stuff for sure. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. You see that language, you guys? That's supposed to remind us of verse 1. This is what it looks like. He's keeping his eyes, which is his spiritual eyes, right? Faith on the invisible, the things of God. Okay, I'm just going to read to the end of the chapter, and there's just a couple of things that are actually quite quick, and then we'll get to small groups. How much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, there he is, Jephthah, another interesting character, David, another interesting character, Samuel, and all the prophets. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions. Sounds like Daniel. Quenched the flames of fire. Sounds like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They escaped death by the edge of the sword. Sounds like a lot of them. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. That sounds like Samson. Women received their loved ones back again from the dead. So both Elijah and Elisha, the prophets, had those types of things happen through them, that God raised people from the dead through these prophets. But others, okay, so now it switches gears. So just in case we get a romantic view of what he's talking about, he switches gears here. But others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. That reminds me of Jesus. Others were chained in prisons. That reminds me of Paul. Some died by stoning. That reminds me of Stephen. Some were sawed in half, and others were killed with the sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats. Sounds like John the Baptist. Destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All these people earned a good reputation or are commended because of their faith. Yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us. Okay, you guys, why does this matter? That's the question, right? Interesting stories, amazing people who are in there, people you would never think would be in there are in there, but they're commended because of faith, and you get to discuss that in your small groups. So why does this matter? Well, ultimately, one big reason. It's the call to live by faith is still for us today, for God's people. The call is to live by faith. So you're going to discuss in your small group what that looks like. I'm going to give you 3 things. First, faith pleases God, right? From verse 6. And this is good news, you guys. Part of the small group scripture is from Galatians. The whole book of Galatians is well, yeah, the whole book is Paul writing to the Galatians to tell them that you guys, you don't need to switch from the mercy of Christ and the Holy Spirit back to the law once you became a Christian. You don't have to now be under the law. Like, you've been set free from that. And his call is to the Galatians is to live by faith. And so part of your small group discussion will have some of Galatians in it. It's good news that we are not under the law. It's faith that pleases God. That's the exciting part of this whole thing, because we can have faith. Secondly, faith gives you eyes to see. And it helps you to see God. It gives you that ability to believe what God says. So that's why faith is so important. It helps us to see what we can't see without it. That's why we can be so sure about who God is, what Jesus has done, like the stuff we've gone through Hebrews about who Jesus is, like why it's so important that he's our perfect high priest, a better high priest. Why it's so important that his sacrifice is better and like the perfect sacrifice, and why we need it. Faith gives us eyes to see that. And then finally, faith enables you to join those who are commended for their faith that we just read about. Faith enables you to join this family of people who have gone before us. These incredible heroes, in some ways become, not even in some ways, they become our ancestors. Right? We become their descendants, which is, odd to some people. But what an incredible history that we have because we are part of God's people. We are part of the people of faith who live by faith. That's God's family. And so they lived by faith and they placed their hope in something better.